My name is Fran Cuthbert. I'm a director for the Pemberton District Museum Society. I am also a member and have been a member for a long time of the Pemberton Women's Institute. My family and I moved to Pemberton in 1990. Originally, prior to that, we'd lived in Whistler. My husband came up to Pemberton and bought a lot for us to build a house on, and I said to him, well, you have a good time, I'm not moving there. But I spent the summer coming up with my kids and learning to really enjoy the village and the surroundings, and we've lived here ever since. And both my children have grown up here, gone to the high school and graduated, and they're married, and we now have 4 grandchildren that live here as well. So we're happily settled. Today I'll be reading from Community Life, Schools and Services from the Pemberton History book, with excerpts from that book. A family on the Portage found different ways to educate its children. For about 2 years before the local public schools opened its doors, the Spetch School at Owl Creek had been accommodating the younger daughters of the family, and a teacher was employed by Samuel Spetch. Both Molly Garvin and Gladys Blakeway taught there. The second Spetch solution to the education problem came after mails were arriving by PGE. Through the 4 or 5 months, he argued the need for lessons by mail. Spetch sent letter after letter to Victoria, the first going direct to the Premier, the Honourable John Oliver. At last, the Superintendent of Education promised help. In 1919, Elizabeth, Muriel, and William Spetch became the first 3 students in the correspondence branch of the British Columbia Department of Education. The father's persistence in demanding education by mail finally persuaded the provincial government to set up what has been described as the oldest and largest system of correspondence education in Canada. When the first trains began to run, just a few Pemberton families were within walking distance of the school site and had children of school age. Among them were the Jack Ronayne family, the Punch family, and the Dermody family. Not until the arrival of the Ross children in the spring of 1915 were numbers sufficient to establish a classroom. The first school trustees were George Thompson, Edwin Harris, and Jack Ronayne, who was the secretary of the board. Near the end of August, when the teacher was expected to arrive, the men of the community were still working on the school building, using lumber from Perkins Mill. Like most rural school boards, the local trustees had chosen the teacher on the basis of her letter of application. On August 21st, Jack Ronayne drove his horse and vehicle about 11 miles to meet the new teacher, Christine Lanaville, who was arriving on the train. To the girl from Lulu Island, the trip with the secretary of the board must have been very alarming. With the rivers and creeks high, Ronayne had lots of trouble on the floating corduroy, but horse and driver negotiated the hazards along the way and delivered Christine to her boarding house not far from the unfinished school building. On August 25, 1915, Pemberton Meadows School opened Hession's house, but pupils were dismissed early that day because Jack Ronayne was putting their desks together. His later diary entries tell of continuing work at the Newbyre Schoolhouse, and on September 25th, the changing of the desks into the new school. He set up the stove, hung blackboards and maps, and split shakes for the school woodshed. Shortly before the Christmas holidays, adults and children gathered for a celebration of the schoolhouse, and all had a very merry time. Because funds were short, school boards could buy only limited supplies. They provide a foolscap for examinations, multicolored construction paper, ink, glue, and chalk. Most schools had a set of wooden objects for standard drawing lessons, and often laboriously pupils drew the sphere, the cylinder, and the pyramid. Then shaded in the shadows, they cast. Books other than texts were mainly for reference. Pemberton Meadows School had a strap, and John Ronayne claims the distinction of it being first used on him when Vivian Ross hit him with a snowball and he said, "Damn." No amount of restoration can restore the smell of an early school. Chalk has a distinctive smell. Without duplicating machines and with up to 8 grades in one room, chalk was in constant use, and if you mix the smell of chalk with whiffs of wood smoke, the smell of spilting, of wet wool drying, of frozen sandwiches toasting at noon on the flat-topped heater, and some body odor, and through all the smells of that sweeping compound, you arrive at an approximation of the cozy community smell. When it was needed, usually the teacher lit the fire. In winter months, if classes were to start on time, with ink thawed and children at their desks, the fire would be lit well before school opening. If not, pupils would stand for an hour or more with books in hand close to the stove. One inspector, as superintendents were then known, arrived one morning very early at Pemberton Middle School, even before the teacher. No kindlings had been cut to start the fire, and even worse, the axe handle was broken. That teacher's rating would suffer. The school at that station had opened in 1929. A year Pemberton Middle School was being built on Roman land. May Tallifer was the first secretary-treasurer of the Pemberton School, and Bertha Bussy Green, the first teacher. Like Upper Valley people, in 1915, people at the station were greatly involved in financing and constructing the new building. Bill Fowler speaks of those good-hearted old-timers, including the two carpenters, Oscar Johnson and Andy Anderson. This is about how that school got started. All these men volunteered their labor, the lumber was brought, and they built the school. They were hammering away the morning school began, and Bussy Pomeroy still remembers the pound over her head as she tried to lead in the Lord's Prayer. Another opening day difficulty was the lack of outhouses, but fortunately the school was nearly surrounded by bushes and trees. The two schools developed a keen rivalry in sports. In 1922, 7 years before Pemberton School's classes started, men at Birken had held a bee and built a school. M.B. Pullinger was the first teacher at that school, which continued in operation until 1944. Unlike many rural teachers, most of those at Birken returned to their jobs for a second year, or even a longer period. At one point, the school closed and then reopened for several years in a new building before closing again. Before the second opening, the first log building, which still stands near Birkenhead Lake, had been remodeled as a teacher's residence. Despite the limitations of the little schools, many children enjoyed and profited by their school days because teachers seemed to make up for lack of experience by interest, ability to improvise, and hard work. And their pupils usually went on to successful careers. What is more, teachers and schools were part of the community, and many teachers formed lifelong friendships. Young women teachers coming into a population with disproportionate number of young bachelors were instant objects of interest. Men would wait at the station to appraise them as they descended from the train. Some rivalries developed. On the old road along the rock slide, Battle Creek was allegedly the scene of a fight between two young men interested in the same school marm. As might be expected, some of the female teachers married and became part of the permanent population. The schools were clearing houses for notices of coming events and evening meeting places for adults. Each of these centers were a valued addition to the life of its community. In 1919, G.M. Downton reported 3 goods stores in the area: Wellington's at Pemberton Station, the Pemberton Trading Company's about 1 mile from the station, and Spetch's at Owl Creek near the Dominion Government Fish Hatchery. Operating there since 1908, the Spetch store continued to draw customers from the Portage and the Valley. With experience in merchandising, Charles Wellington decided to go into business in Pemberton. About the time the first trains began to run, George Stack and Oscar Johnson built a store for him. He lived upstairs, walking on creaking floorboards in the building that became part of the Pemberton market. Wellington was a guy with a big heart. For several weeks, until money arrived from the east, he let 2 young men from Ontario charge their food. For a playing field, he donated land in a pleasant cedar grove. Across the tracks from the station On June 3rd, 1933, community leaders celebrated his birthday by opening Wellington Park. His liking for people and lack of suspicion probably led to the decline of his business. For according to the man who bought him out, some people who worked for Wellington forgot to mark down their groceries. In 1915, William C. Kilts succeeded Frank Brokaw at the Pemberton Trading Company store at Egerton. According to Bill Spetch, Kilts erected the building there now, plus the house and barn. The building, the present Patnod home, then housed both store and post office. About 1920, Kilts asked Joseph Telfer to work at the Egerton store. Twice a week, Telfer recalled, I carried mail and groceries as far as Punch's, driving my own team. Telfer later operated the store for Kilts, and for doing so, he received a monthly paycheck, a house rent-free, and groceries. Then Telfer extended the combined mail and grocery run to the Shaw place. Instead of going down to the Pemberton Meadows post office, some people always found it more convenient to have their mail sorted at Egerton and delivered to their gates. A disadvantage of the Egerton store was that Telfer had to haul water to it. For that reason, about 1930, Kilts told him to pick out a lot at the station, and Telfer chose the site now occupied by the drugstore and its lawn. There, G. O. McLeod, the nephew of Alex McLeod, a young prospector trapper, built him a big new store with living quarters above. A few years later, in October 1934, gasoline from a lamp dripped onto the newly waxed upstairs floor, and when May Telfer lit a match, the lamp exploded. As Alan Budfraser reported in the Pemberton Meadows School News, the stairs were burning so that she could not get down. She had to jump from the top window. Before many days, May Telfer was operating the post office in the community hall. Her husband bought Wellington store and added to the building to make room for living quarters and a post office. Years later, in order to spend more time gardening at home and fishing at Blackwater Lake, Telfer retired. His young son Warren carried on the business. At Owl Creek, William Spetch took over his father's business in the post office in 1929. When Samuel Spetch returned to Burton to open a store, Bill Spetch says that trade at Owl Creek was good, with both hatchery and valley people among his customers. In 1934, the Bridge River Lillooet News called him the Charles Woodward of Owl Creek. By trading beef for lumber, Spetch was able to build a store, which he expanded after the Second World War, and which is now Mount Currie Foods. A few years after he had opened his business in Mount Currie, Spetch closed the Owl Creek business and moved the post office down to the new store. Another store established in the 30s was the Log Cabin store, built on the corner, now occupied by the south end of the Pemberton Hotel. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Prendergrass were the owners of this store with its unique feature, a barber's chair. Prendergrass was the area's first licensed barber. Previously, everybody had relied on haircuts from relatives or friends. In 1924, farmers had begun to organize. The Pemberton Valley Farmers Institute had 30 members. In March 1925, President Lloyd Shore and Secretary John Peter Vanderhoop had signed the bylaws of the organization. N.J. Baker, Sandy Fowler, and Pierre Soulard, with Shore and Vanderhoop, had been subscribers to the Declaration for Incorporation. V.E. Kilts, Jack Ronan, and W.C. Green, who for many years would be an institute, were to promote conditions of rural life so that settlement may be permanent and prosperous, to promote the theory and practice of agriculture by lectures, essays, the circulation of information, and other educational methods, and to stimulate interest by exhibitions, prizes, and other means to arrange on behalf of its members for the purchase, distribution, or sale of commodities. Early in 1941, a group of farmers and businessmen formed the Pemberton and District Cooperative Association, with the object of obtaining feed and supplies more cheaply. Edmund Ronan, John Ronan, Ernest Blakeway, Frank Kershaw, Gunnar Gimps, and Harold Wyatt Purdon attended the first meeting on July 25th that year. starting in a very small way with working capital $500 borrowed from its members. The co-op opened a small store run by Mrs. Prendergrass, but its main business centered on the warehouse built near the railroad tracks. The first manager, Mr. Pope, was paid the princely sum of $5 a week for 2 8-hour days. The following year, Harvey Derrick, for many years part-time station agent, was offered $10 a month for looking after the warehouse. Soon phasing itself out of the grocery part of the business, the co-op took over the Snowflake brand from the Board of Trade and became actively involved in the shipment of both potatoes and turnips through the Interior Vegetable Marketing Board. The Snowflake was registered by the Board of Trade and printed on the sacks to identify Pemberton potatoes. No other area could use this brand. Arthur Momby became manager and shipper in 1945, followed in 1950 by Eric Gethin, who became the first full-time manager, was also responsible for the bookkeeping formerly done by its members of the committee. Harry Erickson took over from Eric Gethin in 1957, and he was followed by John Cosledge in 1959. By 1954, demands of the Vancouver wholesalers for washed potatoes provided the incentive for the Pemberton Co-op to approach the government for assistance in building a packing house, which with considerable government help was eventually completed in the fall of 1956. Jack Nelson won the contract and paid his workers $1.75 an hour, among whom were Magnus Erdl, Bert Lundgren, Morgan Miller, Henry Erickson, the first 3 serving as the building committee. The Farmers Institute continued through the early 40s, but it was fairly inactive from 1945 to 1953 because its function was taken over by the Seed Growers Association, and the same men were members of both groups. With the decline of the seed market of the 50s, the Farmers Institute became revitalized and supported the co-op in its drive for a warehouse, for the marketing of commercial potatoes, and bringing in speakers to talk on the possibility of other crops for the area. Apart from their control of the seed potato growing, the Pemberton and District Seed Growers Association also agreed each year on the selling price for their produce, a price which often dropped as the season wore on. Every year they held a field day in late July or early August and invited buyers to view the fields. In the early 50s, prizes were given for the best fields judged on freedom from disease, cultivation, and appearance. Lunch for the visitors was served by the farmers' wives in the Upper Valley Hall, and a dance was held in the evening after the visitors had left. Interest flagged when machinery and fertilizer salesmen outnumbered the buyers. And the buyers who did come kept a low profile on price and emphasized instead the great way of life you have here. Abandoned for several years when the potato market suffered a depression, the virus-free program saw the revival of the field days in the late 60s and plenty of interest from buyers. On January 31st, 1940, 12 women met at the Upper Valley Clubhouse to discuss war work and the possibility of setting up an organization with as broad a base as possible, open to all women of the valley. The Women's Auxiliary, with its close Anglican connection, had a limited appeal to women of other religious affiliations. After considering information at both the Women's Institute and the Red Cross Society, the women decided on the former, with Frances Stecker as the first president, Gladys Roden vice president, Margaret Fougberg secretary, and Joy Gerling and Margaret Green as directors. To express their support of Ada Taylor and the Red Cross group of the Lower Valley, Maria Fraser was appointed convener for the Red Cross work. Directors' meetings were held to discuss the organization, and the following month the first regular meeting was held. Among those who attended the first meeting were Sitzel Ross, Irene Blakeway, Annie Ronan, Mrs. Prendergrass, Edith Lansdowne, Mrs. Blatter, Mary Tellifer, Dorothy Gurley, Adela Fowler, Clarice Erdl, and Maud Ronan. The early efforts of the Women's Institute, or WI as it was usually called, concentrated on contributing to the war effort by making garments and canvassing for funds for the Red Cross, preserving food for relief purposes, collecting salvage, wool for blankets, comforter bats, donating clothing, comforters, and money for Russian relief, sending comfort parcels to local boys serving overseas and to other Canadian soldiers at overseas hospitals, appealing for free transportation for soldiers so that leave could be spent at home. Now, after the end of the war, joining with the Rangers in holding a VA Day celebration, which included ceremonies, speeches, songs, field sports, and a ball game. With all their war work, the women found time to hold quilting bees, cater to field days at the illustration farm, organize dances, picnics, and sports days. As early as 1943, Francis Decker appealed at a WI meeting for a permanent record of the Pemberton pioneers. In November 1946, the first WI banquet held in the Upper Valley Hall offered, in addition to the food, raffles, a quiz program, a bazaar, and dancing with music supplied by Bert Lundgren, Bert Summerskill, and Ed and Billy Wilson. This banquet moved to the community hall the following year and became a popular yearly event offering a fine menu of variety dishes, followed by entertainment and dancing. For it was a family affair, with everyone from grandmothers to babies in arms attending. To recall those banquets of the late 40s and early 50s, it must be remembered that the lack of phones made careful planning ahead of time essential. Under the energetic leadership of Lillian Shore, the WI was involved in health programs such as dental clinics for children and the Well Women Cancer Clinics and the health center itself, which was the WI's proposal for a centennial project and which had received enthusiastic support from other organizations. In 1958, the Centennial Committee, on which Lillian Shore served, obtained a federal centennial grant, as well as assistance from the Public Health Service and the Red Cross, and the center opened that centennial year. Considerable sums were also raised locally, every club sponsoring a money-raising project. Nielsen, Don Default, Bill Spetch, Bill Davis, and Jack Guthrie. At this point, the Red Cross separated from the WI and formed the first Pemberton chapter under the presidency of Ada Graham, with Vice President Sitzel Ross, Bill Pascal, and Peggy Curry. Secretary was Mrs. Larry Adolph. Treasurer, Eileen Brotherston. And officers, Mrs. Dawn Neal, Fran and Harry Erickson, Father Coffin, and Margaret Mitchell for the juniors. The WI also took care of the social amenities, with Christmas gifts for the younger children, flowers for the sick, greetings to new residents, friendship teas, showers for burnt-out families, and even centennial spoons for babies born in 1958. For the community welfare, they badgered the BC Electric and BC Telephone for service, helped to provide a wheelchair for Squamish Station, furnished a ward in Squamish Hospital, pushed the PG into offering reduced fares for high school students for weekend trips home, supported the men's organizations in their appeals for diking and drainage, better roads, rural mail service, and all and any improvements that the government might be persuaded to make. The Women's Institute provided an outlet for the energies of the Pemberton women when they were isolated from the lower mainland by the lack of a road, and offered much needed information center in an era of poor radio reception and no television at all. The meetings were far from formal. The discussions were lively, as on local issues, feelings ran strong. The social over tea provided a chance to visit with neighbors and catch up on local gossip. In 1949, Francis Decker won the Tweedsmuir Cup, presented every 3 years by the Federated Women's Institute Canada on a Canada-wide basis for the best essay on a selected topic. She wrote, "We will endeavor in all ways," she said at the end of her essay, "to keep harmony in our institute and our community, to work for tolerance and cooperation among those of diverse creeds and nationalities." Thus we will take a forward look in these anxious days, remembering the one who said, "Fear not." And remember, when we think of our motto for home and country, that home is in the present day world means sanctuary for all in need of comfort, security, and the outstretched hand of friendship, and that country extends far beyond the boundaries of our beloved Canada.